The smell told you someone in the house was dying. That sweet, rotting smell that meant flesh was decomposing while the person was still alive. Your mother had developed a fever 3 days ago. Then the swelling started. Lumps under her arms and in her groin growing larger each day until they were the size of eggs, black and purple and leaking pus. The plague. Everyone knew what it meant. Your father had barricaded the door from the inside because once the authorities knew someone in your house had it, they'd nail the door shut from the outside. Lock your entire family in to die together. You were 10 years old, and you'd watched your mother deteriorate from a healthy woman to something that barely looked human. Her skin had turned black in patches. She couldn't speak anymore, just moaned in constant pain. Your 2 younger sisters huddled in the corner, too terrified to go near her. Your father sat with his head in his hands, knowing that any day now the rest of you would start showing symptoms. Because plague didn't just take one person. It took entire families, entire streets, entire cities. This was life in medieval Europe, not knights and castles and romantic tales. Just disease and death and the absolute certainty that you were going to die young, probably in agony, with no way to stop it or even understand why it was happening. Medieval Europe from roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries was a death trap. The average life expectancy was 30 to 35 years, and that's only if you survived childhood. 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Disease was constant and everywhere. Plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, leprosy, measles, diseases we can prevent or treat today killed millions. There was no understanding of germs or infection, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no effective treatments at all. Medical knowledge was based on ancient theories about balancing humors and the position of stars. Physicians would bleed you, purge you, or apply leeches. These treatments usually made you worse. Most people never saw a physician anyway because they couldn't afford one. You just got sick and either recovered or died based entirely on luck and the strength of your immune system. Living conditions made disease spread rapidly. Cities were overcrowded, filthy, with no sanitation systems. Human and animal waste filled the streets. Water sources were contaminated. Houses were cramped, poorly ventilated, shared with livestock. Entire families slept in one room, often in one bed. When someone got sick, everyone got sick. And then everyone died. That was normal, expected. Death was so common it was woven into every aspect of daily life. Thomas Carpenter was 10 when plague came to his village in England in 1348. It started with the baker's family. First the baker died, then his wife, then their 4 children, one after another over the course of a week. The bodies were taken to the church, but there were too many dead to bury properly. They were just piled in the churchyard. Then the blacksmith's family got sick, then the miller's, then Thomas's neighbors. The disease moved through the village like fire through dry grass. Within 2 weeks, half the village was dead or dying. Thomas's mother got sick first in his family. She developed the fever and the swellings. She screamed from the pain of the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that were the plague's signature. Thomas's father tried to help her, but there was nothing he could do. No medicine, no treatment. Just watching her suffer until she died 3 days after the symptoms started. Thomas's father got sick next, then his 8-year-old sister. Thomas waited for his own symptoms to appear, certain he was next, but they didn't come. He stayed healthy while his father and sister died within days of each other. Thomas was suddenly alone, both parents dead, his sister dead. He was 10 years old with no family left and no idea how to survive. The village was devastated. Out of 200 people, maybe 70 survived. The fields weren't being worked because most of the farmers were dead. The church was locked because the priest had died. Bodies were everywhere, in houses, in streets, rotting where they'd fallen because there weren't enough living people to bury them. The smell was overwhelming. The sound was worse. Crying, moaning from the sick who were dying alone because everyone was too afraid to help them. Dogs and pigs feeding on corpses in the streets because no one could stop them. Thomas wandered through this nightmare, looking for anyone who could tell him what to do. He found other orphan children, maybe a dozen of them. They banded together, breaking into empty houses looking for food. Most houses had bodies in them. Sometimes the bodies had been dead for days, sometimes weeks. Rats and insects covered them. The children learned to search quickly, take what food they could find, and leave before the smell made them vomit. This was survival, looting the homes of the dead just to eat for another day. Winter came. Without enough people to harvest, most of the crops had rotted in the fields. Food was scarce. Thomas and the other orphans were starving. Some died from hunger. Others froze because they had no proper shelter. The adults who'd survived had their own families to worry about. No one wanted to take in extra mouths to feed. Thomas watched children he'd known his entire life die from cold and starvation. He watched them grow weaker, stop moving, stop breathing. By spring, half the orphans were dead. Thomas survived by stealing, by begging, by eating things he wouldn't have considered food before. Rats, tree bark, grass, anything to fill his stomach. He was 11 years old and looked like a skeleton. His clothes were rags. His hair was falling out from malnutrition. His teeth were loose. He knew he was dying slowly. Just not as fast as the others. If you were Thomas, surrounded by death, orphaned, starving, living in a village that had become a graveyard, would you have kept fighting to survive? Or would you have given up, accepted that death was coming anyway, and stopped trying? Disease wasn't the only threat. Injury was often fatal. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could leave you crippled or cause an infection that spread through your body. Childbirth killed women constantly. 1 in 10 women died giving birth. If you survived childhood and avoided plague, injury was the next most likely cause of death. Thomas broke his arm when he was 12, falling while trying to steal apples from a tree. The bone healed wrong because there was no one to set it properly. His arm was permanently crooked, weak, painful. It limited what work he could do for the rest of his life. A merchant passing through the village took pity on Thomas and some of the other surviving orphans. He took them to a monastery 50 miles away where the monks agreed to take them in. The journey took a week on foot. They had no shoes. They had minimal food. 2 of the children died during the journey, just collapsed from exhaustion and never got up. The merchant left their bodies by the roadside. There was no time for burial. The living had to keep moving. The monastery was better than the village, but not by much. The monks were kind enough, but resources were limited. The children were put to work immediately. Thomas's job was helping in the gardens and doing whatever manual labor the monks needed. The work was hard, but at least there was food. Not much and not good, but regular. Thomas survived. He grew, though never to full size. The malnutrition of his early years had stunted him permanently. He developed a chronic cough from living in damp, cold conditions. The monastery was stone with no heat except in the main hall. The dormitory where the children slept was freezing. Thomas was sick more often than healthy. Colds that turned into chest infections. Fevers that lasted weeks. Stomach ailments from food that was often spoiled. He lived in constant discomfort and pain. This was normal for medieval life. Everyone was always sick with something. Health was relative. If you could walk and work, you were considered healthy even if you were coughing blood and running a fever. But here's what makes medieval life even more horrific. People understood they were dying but had no ability to stop it. They watched plague wipe out entire cities and blamed it on God's wrath or bad air or Jews poisoning wells. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses, no understanding of how disease spread. So they couldn't protect themselves. They'd pray. They'd flagellate themselves. They'd burn incense or wear herbs. None of it worked. They'd watch their children die and think it was God's will or punishment for sin. The randomness was terrifying. A healthy person could be dead in days. A sick person might recover while healthy family members died. There was no pattern you could understand, no way to predict or prevent. You just lived with constant fear that today might be the day you got sick, that this fever might be the one that killed you, that your child's cough might turn into the illness that took them. Death was always present, always one bad day away, and there was nothing you could do except accept it. Think about modern medicine, antibiotics, surgery, vaccines, pain relief, life expectancy of 70, 80 years. Now imagine all of that gone. Imagine dying at 35 being lucky. Imagine watching half your children die before age 5 and accepting it as normal. Could you have lived like that? Could you have continued having children knowing most would die? Could you have faced each day knowing disease could take you at any moment? Most people in medieval Europe didn't live long. Thomas made it to 32. He spent 20 years at the monastery, working in the gardens, praying with the monks, surviving. He never fully recovered from the trauma of watching his family die and living through the plague. He never married, never had children. He just existed day after day doing his work waiting for death. It came in the form of dysentery, a common killer. He developed severe diarrhea and stomach cramps. Within 3 days, he was so dehydrated he couldn't stand. The monks gave him water, but his body couldn't keep it down. Everything he drank came back up or went straight through him. His body was shutting down from fluid loss. He died after 5 days of suffering. His last thoughts were of his mother, of his father and sister, of the village that had died when he was 10. He'd survived the plague only to die from an intestinal infection that modern medicine could have cured with simple rehydration and antibiotics. But those didn't exist. So Thomas died, was buried in the monastery cemetery, and was forgotten. Medieval life was short, painful, and filled with death. This wasn't unique to Thomas's experience. This was everyone's experience. Rich people died from disease too, though they had better food and shelter, which improved their odds slightly. But plague killed nobles and peasants alike. Injury killed everyone. Childbirth didn't care about social status. The medieval period killed people indiscriminately and constantly. Villages were wiped out by disease. Cities lost half their populations to plague outbreaks. Famines killed millions when crops failed. Wars killed millions more. And through all of it, people just continued. They had children knowing most would die. They worked knowing they'd probably die young. They lived with pain and suffering as constant companions because there was no alternative. This was life. This was normal. This was all anyone knew. The survivors of each plague outbreak, each famine, each epidemic, they'd rebuild, have more children to replace the dead, work the fields again, try to continue. And then the next disaster would come. The next plague wave, the next famine, the next war. The cycle never ended. Medieval Europe was caught in a loop of death and survival and death again. Progress was impossible when you were always rebuilding from the last catastrophe. Knowledge couldn't advance when educated people died before they could pass on what they'd learned. Society couldn't improve when half the population died every few decades. It was stagnation enforced by constant death, and people accepted it. They had no choice. They couldn't imagine a world where children usually survived to adulthood, where people lived to 60 or 70, where diseases could be prevented or cured. That was unthinkable, so they adapted to reality as it was. They accepted that life was short and painful, that death came early and often. That suffering was the normal human condition. Even after the medieval period ended, after the Renaissance brought some advances in medicine and sanitation, the fundamental patterns continued for centuries. People continued dying young from preventable diseases until the discovery of germ theory in the 19th century and antibiotics in the 20th. Thomas died in 1370, but people were dying from similar causes in similar numbers well into the 1800s. 600 years of technological and social progress, and the basic experience of disease and death remained largely unchanged. That's how deeply entrenched these problems were. That's how little human life mattered when measured against the impossibility of fighting diseases you couldn't see or understand. Thomas and millions like him died because they lived before modern medicine, before humanity figured out how to fight back against the microscopic killers that had plagued us for all of history. Their suffering built nothing, taught nothing, accomplished nothing. It was just suffering for its own sake, just the brutal reality of being human in an era when human life was cheap and death was the only certainty. That's medieval Europe. That's what life really meant. Not romance or chivalry or grand adventure. Just disease, death, and the daily struggle to survive in a world designed to kill you.